We're going to be having this debate between Peter Wallison, former White House counsel of George Herbert Walker Bush, who takes the position that the housing meltdown, financial crisis had everything to do with bad government and very little to do with Wall Street greed, and Michael Hiltzig, the business writer for the LA Times, who says the opposite. The debate is coming up right now. In one corner, we have Michael Hiltzig. He's the LA Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, author of The New Deal, A Modern History. His position on the financial crisis is that the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission's conclusions clearly point out the failures by regulators and the unregulated to rein in the excesses that led to ruin. In the other corner, weighing in at a trim 160 pounds, Peter Wallison, former White House counsel to George Herbert Walker Bush and currently a fellow at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, and he's one of the Republicans chosen by Congress to be on the Financial Inquiry Commission. And his conclusion is that this is all about bad government policy. He blames the global meltdown on government's affordable housing program and all of the agencies that went along in that program. Peter Wallison, please say hello to Michael Hiltzig.
Hello, Michael.
Hello, Peter. How are you?
I'm fine, and I'm going to enjoy this discussion with you. I'm glad we've had this opportunity.
Okay,
so
now we've hired a cut man, so we're having a standing 8 count. It's in effect. I want no rabbit punching, no kidney punching. Peter, why don't you go first? It is your position. You wrote a 100-page dissent that I think only you and I read, and you don't count because you wrote it. And you talk about Freddie and Fannie and the Community Reinvestment Act and all these government programs designed so that so-called underrepresented people would be able to buy a home, and that is the basis for the financial meltdown and the housing crisis. Have I pretty much correctly summarized your position, Peter?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I was hoping to be able to summarize it in about 5 minutes.
Well, what I want you to do is take 90 seconds and you summarize your position, and then I want Michael to explain his position, and then we'll take it from there.
Don't know that I can do it in 90, but let me try. Look, before 1992, Fannie and Freddie bought almost solely prime mortgages. But beginning that year, the government required Fannie and Freddie to direct a substantial portion of their mortgage financing to borrowers who are at or below the median income in their communities. The original quota was 30%, but the Department of Housing and Urban Development was given authority to adjust it. And through the Clinton and the George W. Bush administrations, it was increased to 50% in 2000 and then to 55% in 2007. Look, I want to point out that, as you can see, this is not a partisan issue. Both the Clinton and the George W. Bush administrations had a role in pushing for these higher affordable housing requirements. Now, it's certainly possible to find prime borrowers among people with incomes below the median income. But when more than half of all the mortgages that Fannie and Freddie were required to buy had to have this characteristic, that is below the median income, they had to significantly reduce their underwriting standards in order to find these loans. So Fannie and Freddie were not the only government-backed organizations that were enlisted in this process. The Federal Housing Administration was, and under the Community Reinvestment Act, many regulated banks were, and in fact, some of these loans, according to HUD standards and as applied to the banks, were required loans to people with 80% of median income, and in some cases, very low income, 60% of median income. Now, what that meant was that by the year 2008, this is 16 years later, there were 28 million loans, subprime and other poor quality loans in our financial system. That's half of all mortgages in the United States. And these mortgages were subprime or otherwise risky. That is, they were not good loans. Half of the mortgages were mortgages with blemished credit, that is, people with low credit scores. Another substantial portion of those loans were made to people with no or very low down payments, no documentation, interest only, or made to people who were investors and not people who were going to occupy the homes. So by 2008, of that 28 million loans, 74% were held or guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac or one of these other government agencies. That's almost three-quarters. And so it is clear where the demand for those loans came from. It did not come originally from the private sector. Now, this huge government investment in private mortgages did achieve its purpose. It increased home ownership from about 64% in 1995 to about 69% in 2004. But it also built a gigantic bubble. This bubble lasted for 10 years, from 1997 to 2007, and created a real demand for private mortgage-backed securities backed by subprime loans. That such a market had never existed before, but it was started because when a bubble grows, it tends to suppress delinquencies and defaults because people can always refinance the home or sell the home without any losses. And when investors saw this happening in the early 2000s, they started to want these mortgages, and this triggered a private system, which is the one that has mostly been blamed. Now, that private system, which was done by Wall Street, produced 26% of that large number, that 28 million subprime or other poor quality loans. But only 26% was from the private sector. The rest was from the government. So it doesn't seem to me that you can blame the private system for what was basically a set of government policies that produced this problem.
Okay.
And when all of these mortgages started to fail, that's when they infected all of the financial institutions, causing the financial crisis. So that's basically my point.
Okay, Peter, you bogarted your way into taking 5 minutes. So, Michael Hilter, we're going to take a break, and then, Michael, you can take your 5 minutes.
All right.
Okay?
Thanks.
Gentlemen, don't go away. 1-800-222-KBC. Michael Hiltick will strike back when we come back. This is Larry Elder. Peter Wallison, a member of the Financial Inquiry Commission, also a fellow with the AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, former House counsel to George Herbert Walker Bush, has just spent 5 minutes explaining why he believes it was bad government policy that caused the financial meltdown. In the opposite corner, Michael Hiltig, the LA Times columnist, Pulitzer Prize winner, author of the book, The New Deal, A Modern History. Michael, you have 5 minutes, sir.
All right. Well, I'm not sure I'll need all that time, but first I want to commend Peter for the tenacity with which he's been arguing this point. I know he's been talking about this for several years. It was, in fact, the gist of his dissent from the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission report, 98 pages a year or two ago. But I also want to point out that when he says this is not that this is a bipartisan issue, he's right, because both the Democratic majority of the commission on which he served and the Republican minority, that is, the three Republicans other than himself, both disputed his interpretation of what caused the financial crisis. And I'll just read to you from the other Republicans who said neither the Community Reinvestment Act, which is the act that Peter says was the instrument of federal policy that was behind all this, nor the removal of the Glass-Steagall firewall was a significant cause of the financial crisis. And then the majority picked apart the basic numbers that Peter has just repeated in terms of how many problem loans were held by Fannie and Freddie, how many they originated, what their actual risk profile was. And I would also quote, by the way, Fed Governor Randall Krosner. He was then Fed Governor. This was in 2008, the Federal Reserve, who said he didn't believe he had Fed staff analyze all of the mortgage data from this period, and he said that the Fannie and Freddie, that the CRA institutions that were responsible to the Community Reinvestment Act had a very small share of the total market. In fact, so small that, and I'm quoting him here, it's hard to imagine how this law could have contributed in any meaningful way to the current subprime crisis. Now, that was in 2008. So just to look at some of the figures that Peter's used, he repeats a number that has sort of become a mantra in his argument, which is that somewhat nearly half of all the loans in the United States, I think 27 million loans is the number, were subprime and other high-risk loans. Now, other analysts than myself have pointed to that line as being sort of sleight of hand, because you've got subprime and you've got other high-risk loans, but they're not all subprime, and they're all very different, and they all have very different records of performance. Now, the Financial Crisis Commission on which Peter served looked at these numbers. They looked at the numbers that Peter has used, and they pointed out that if you look at the loans that were held by Fannie and Freddie, these are the GSEs, the government-sponsored entities, even the loans that went to borrowers who were not the best borrowers, they were not prime borrowers, those with FICO scores, and any of us who've had a mortgage knows what your FICO score is. Those with substandard FICO scores below 660 performed much, much better. That is, the loans that were held by Fannie and Freddie than the loans that were originated and held by private companies. The private label securitizations, these companies that went out and originated loans and packaged them up and sold them to anyone who would buy them, well, they accounted for something like 13% of all the loans in the United States market, but 42% of the loans that were in serious delinquency. So they were the ones who were really undermining underwriting standards. Now, I think Peter's basic point is that, well, it may be that private enterprise swept into this market and undermined underwriting and undermined standards, but that was because the market was created by the CRA and Fannie and Freddie. And this sort of argument strikes me as sort of the devil made me do it. That, oh well, gee, you have to defend Countrywide and Bank of America and Ameriquest and all these other companies that were producing really crummy, toxic loans, to say, well, they had no choice because the market was demanding that they get into the market. I just don't buy that. The fact of the matter is that the private industry, private financial corporations produced much, much more substandard loans than Fannie and Freddie, and these companies that were not responsible to the Community Reinvestment Act weren't answering to it, weren't responding to it. They did much worse than the companies that were responding to the CRA. And the government-sponsored loans, the loans that met government standards, consistently performed a lot better, much, much better than the ones that were generated essentially by Wall Street.
Michael, I have a surprise for you. You took 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Peter?
Yeah. Do I get a chance?
Yeah, please respond.
Okay, well, here goes. First of all, I did not blame the CRA particularly. I blamed, as I said at the outset, the affordable housing requirements imposed by Congress and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Very important to understand this. I did say in my dissent that it was very difficult to identify significant bad loans that came from a significant number of bad loans that came from CRA. One of the reasons was the FDIC simply wouldn't investigate the CRA. But in any event, I did not blame the CRA. I blamed the affordable housing requirements, and one of the reasons was they were what applied to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, not the CRA. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were the dominant players in the U.S. government housing system for many years, and especially between 1992 and 2007. Now, when Randy Krosner was defending the CRA, fine, he can defend the CRA. The Fed had enforced it for many years. I'm certainly not surprised that the Fed and the governor of the Fed would defend it. But in any event, that is not the basic. Those were not the basic figures that I was using. Again, I will repeat that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and other government agencies, including FHA and the VA and others, created the demand for 75% of those very low-quality mortgages. And it was the bubble that they created from 1992 on that created the first time we have ever had a private market in subprime mortgages. The reason for that, as I suggested before, was that when a bubble is growing, you can make all kinds of terrible loans, and the fact is that people then can refinance or they can sell the home without suffering any losses. So suddenly you had a whole series of very risky mortgages that were bearing very high interest rates that really weren't showing many losses, and investors wanted those. But in any event, what Wall Street did was was just about a quarter of all the really poor mortgages in the country. The rest of those mortgages were on the balance sheets of government agencies, which created the demand for those things. Now, this argument that Fannie and Freddie, their mortgages were not as bad as the private sector mortgages has always sort of troubled me. I don't understand why that is such a good argument. Fannie and Freddie had an absolutely bulletproof franchise. They were the dominant players in the U.S. housing market, which is the largest market of any kind in the United States, and they became insolvent. And how did they become insolvent? They became insolvent because they were required to buy these terrible mortgages, and they have now cost the U.S. taxpayers about $150 billion, and according to their regulator, that will be somewhere, in the end, it will be somewhere between $220 and $350 billion.
Okay, that was Peter Wallison.
Their mortgages were quite bad enough.
That was Peter Wallison. He's a member of the Financial Inquiry Commission and says that the housing meltdown had to do with bad government policy. Michael Hiltzig, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, LA Times, says that it was lax government oversight, failure to do the kinds of regulations that we should be doing. Michael, you're going to take about 4 minutes, top of the hour, to respond to what Peter said, and then we'll take some calls. The number is 1-800-222-KBC. That's 1-800-222-KBC. Time now to weigh in. Who's right, Peter or Michael? 1-800-222-5222. Buenas tardes, Los Angeles. Larry Elder here, the sage from South Central. Thank you very much for joining me. We are in the middle of a debate between Peter Wallison. He is the former White House counsel for George Herbert Walker Bush, also a member of the Financial Inquiry Commission. He wrote a nearly 100-page dissent arguing that the majority is wrong. The majority blame the housing and financial crisis on Wall Street greed, lack of oversight, lack of regulation. And Peter Wallison blames it on bad government policy that basically encouraged people who otherwise would not have been able to get a conventional loan to get homes and use the power of government to effectuate that. Michael Hiltzig, the LA Times columnist, is a Pulitzer Prize winner, author of the book The New Deal, A Modern History. And Michael, in a second, I'll give you 3-4 minutes to respond to what Peter said the last segment. Bottom of this hour, we're going to be talking to a man who writes for The Blaze. That is the website that's run by Glenn Beck. LA Times had a story this morning called Chicano Studies Classes Vanish. And it's about a elimination of Chicano Studies courses in Arizona because of a state law that says you can't have a class that promotes resentment towards a race or towards a class of people. The LA Times, however, did not give us any specifics about what kinds of things were being taught in these courses. The front page editor of The Blaze will tell us at the bottom of the hour. Peter, Michael, again, thank you very much for participating in this debate. And Michael, it's your turn. You have about 4 minutes to respond to what Peter just said.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would point out that Peter is absolutely right in saying that Fannie and Freddie are insolvent. But a lot of other companies that were engaged in the mortgage market are also insolvent. Countrywide is insolvent. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, they went out of business in part because of their playing in this market. Bank of America, well, it's solvent, but just about. AIG, that's insolvent. And the fact of the matter is that once again, Peter says it wasn't the Community Reinvestment Act that he was talking about that created this bubble, but federal housing policy. But once again, federal housing policy, no matter how you define it, didn't mandate the deterioration of underwriting standards that we saw in the course of this bubble. And if you look at the mortgages that were originated for Fannie and Freddie compared to the mortgages that were originated outside Fannie and Freddie, you see once again that the mortgages inside Fannie and Freddie were much more responsible, they were much more carefully underwritten, and they performed much, much better than those that were essentially securitized and created by these cowboys on Wall Street. Just a couple of figures, once again, from the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission report. If you look at the Fannie and Freddie pool of mortgages, they had an average rate of serious delinquency of 5.7%. Those are the loans that had down payments of less than 10%. 5.7% if they were originated for Fannie and Freddie, 15.5% if they were originated outside of Fannie and Freddie. That's just one indicator that the deterioration of standards was really just hog wild outside Fannie and Freddie. Yes, everybody went down. When you have a bubble that bursts, it makes a lot of decisions that look good at the time look pretty bad in retrospect. But even in that context, the performance of government responsible agencies, that's Fannie and Freddie, companies that were responsible to the Community Reinvestment Act, perform much, much better than the unregulated companies, the ones that didn't have to respond to anybody, that had no regulators looking at what they were doing. They did much, much worse, and they ended up being much, much more costly to the economy than Fannie and Freddie.
I'd like to ask Michael a question. Michael, Barney Frank was a staunch defender of Fannie and Freddie. He was kind of chastised, I believe, on the Bill O'Reilly show for defending Fannie and Freddie, and in Bill O'Reilly's view, misleading investors into thinking that they were far more solvent than they were. Surprisingly, Barney Frank has now said Fannie and Freddie should be privatized. If Fannie and Freddie didn't play a central role in the housing meltdown, Michael, why would somebody like Barney Frank suddenly do a 180 and say Freddie and Fannie should be privatized?
Well, I think those are two different issues, and I didn't hear. I'm not familiar with Barney's encounter with Bill O'Reilly on that show, but the fact of the matter is that there's reason to debate whether a company that is in the private market really should be playing with a federal guarantee. And there were these concerns going way back to the point when Fannie and Freddie first actually went into the private market. Their role was always murky, and that was always going to be a problem. Did they have the full faith and credit of the United States government behind them? Did they not? Would the government step in only if they got into trouble? Nobody ever really knew, and there was a lot of unease in the market and, in fact, in government about what Fannie and Freddie were supposed to be because they had evolved over the years. I think Fannie really started in the 30s. Freddie came along a little bit later. So, sure, should the government have these quasi-public agencies in the private market? Well, maybe they shouldn't, and I think, Congressman Frank, or soon-to-be ex-Congressman Frank, probably came around to that idea. But that's different from the question of, did Fannie and Freddie create the crisis? Everybody who has looked at this, at least most people who've looked at it, ranging from governors of the Fed to the majority and the Republican minority of the Financial Crisis Commission, say you cannot lay the financial meltdown on Fannie and Freddie or on government policy. It was much broader than that. It was much more complex, and there were a lot of guilty parties. But federal housing policy is not the right place to look.
Peter, your response.
Yeah, I'd love to. Every GOP, every Republican presidential candidate in the debates has now adopted my position. It was also just adopted by the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, and that is that it was government housing policy which caused the crisis. I will not try to explain, talk about complicated, I will not try to explain why my other colleagues on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission did not agree with my data. But after my data has been reviewed by lots of people who read my dissent, it turns out that most Republicans in Congress, as well as all Republican presidential candidates, have agreed that indeed it was the government's housing policy, and many of those people actually had voted for it before and did not understand what it was that what damage it was doing to the economy. The real thing that I think Michael is missing here when he talks about the difference between Fannie's poor quality loans and the poor quality loans in the private sector is the huge difference in size between Fannie Mae and its domination of the market and the private sector's role in the market. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the other, they were the major ones, but there were other government agencies enlisted in this too, and as I said initially, and that they produced 74% of all these terrible mortgages. Now, when 74% of half of all mortgages, 28 million mortgages, begin to default or are defaulting at unprecedented rates, of course it's going to cause a huge decline in housing prices all over the country, something that had never happened before. And the reason it had never happened before is that we had never had an affordable housing requirement that spread these poor quality mortgages throughout the financial system. Now, what Michael said is true in this sense. There was nothing in what the government required Fannie and Freddie to do that said you have to reduce your underwriting standards. However, when you are required to buy loans that are to people who don't have good credit and the quota continues to rise you have to reduce your underwriting standards in order to meet the government's requirements. And that's exactly what Fannie and Freddie and other government agencies had to do.
That was Peter Wollaston. That was Peter Wollaston. He's a former White House counsel for George Herbert Walker Bush, a fellow with AEI, and a former member of the Financial Inquiry Commission. His opponent, Michael Hiltzig, L.A. Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, author of the book The New Deal: Modern History. Michael, Peter, we're going to take a break. Michael, I'll give you a quick chance to respond to what Peter said, and then we're going to take some calls, if you gentlemen don't mind. 1-800-222-KBC. Jeannie will be my first caller. She is at Porter Ranch. She said, didn't people know the government would bail them out? Jeannie, you'll be my first caller. Don't go away. This is Larry Elder. So many people are calling who want to talk to Peter Wollaston and or Michael Hiltzig that we're going to move the front page editor of The Blaze, who's going to talk about the Chicano Studies courses that have been outlawed in Arizona because of a new state law that says you can't have a course that promotes racial hostility. The L.A. Times wrote a column about it, an article about it, but didn't mention any of the courses that this Chicano Studies courses were offering to students in Arizona. And when you find out what the courses were, it's really quite chilling. And this is an investigation of Arizona themselves, some of the things that they uncovered that were going on in those classrooms. The front page editor of The Blaze will be with us tomorrow. Peter Wollaston is the former House counsel. Peter, I've been saying House counsel to George Herbert Walker Bush. Was it Reagan or Bush?
Reagan.
Okay, I'm sorry. You never corrected me. Thank you. That's very polite of you. And Michael Hiltzig, in the L.A. Times, columnist, Pulitzer Prize winner. And Michael and Peter disagree about the root causes of the financial meltdown, the housing crisis. Peter believes it's government policy, bad government policy, and Michael believes it's a lack of regulation, lack of oversight, government oversight. Michael, Peter just made another comment, and I want you to respond to his, and then we're going to take some calls if you guys don't mind.
All right. Well, I would just mention, Peter pointed out that all of the Republican candidates for president, and I think he mentioned the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, agree with him that Fannie and Freddie, or at least federal housing policy, is the root cause of the financial meltdown. And all I would say is that that group sort of strikes me as an ideologically, or at least philosophically, homogeneous group. And it reminds me of what President John F. Kennedy said back in the 60s when he was at a press conference, and a reporter mentioned that the Republican National Committee had just adopted a resolution saying that he was pretty much of a failure. Kennedy's comeback was, "Well, I'm sure it was passed unanimously." So I'm not surprised that Republicans who are and the Wall Street Journal editorial page are of one mind on this, but I don't. Basically, the numbers don't support this interpretation.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure, and then let's go to the phones. Go ahead, Peter.
Simply responding to the argument that Michael made that 3 Republicans on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission didn't agree with me. Now I'm telling him and you and everyone else who wants to listen that, yes, there were these 3 Republicans. You can ask them why they didn't agree, but the rest of Congress and all the presidential candidates do agree with me. And now, of course, Michael is saying, well, of course they do. I think they agree with me because they've had a chance to read my dissent. And those who have read my dissent have find it very persuasive because of the data that's in it. Okay. Jeannie is in Porter Ranch. Jeannie, you're on with Peter Wollaston and Michael Hiltzig. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Yes, Mr. Peter Wollaston. Thank you, Larry, for having on your show. Mr. Peter Wollaston, I agree with you 100%. I have seen it firsthand, especially here in California, Palmdale, North Hollywood area, where people knew that the government was going to back up their mortgages. They purposely got behind, so they would have a year and a half without making payments because they knew, I'm repeating myself, that the government was going to be there to back them up. When did you ever have in the past when you bought a home, either you lost it or you make the payments for it?
Jeannie, thank you for the question. I'll direct that to Michael. Michael, what do you think?
Well, I think the evidence, the record shows that, in fact, the government has not bailed out most of these people. In fact, we would probably be better off economically if the government did more to help people who are underwater in their mortgages. Now, I think Jeannie is referring to people she thinks clearly should not have had these mortgages or got a break. But I think government policy today has left a lot of people who entered mortgages that went bad through no fault of their own, that has left them behind. And that to me is is an issue for public policy that has not been addressed.
Peter Wallison, isn't the whole point behind Freddie and Fannie is that they will either implicitly or now explicitly guarantee these loans, and therefore it changed the behavior of everybody down the chain, including the Wall Street characters?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right, and I thought that was the thrust of the comment from the caller, and that is behavior is changed when people know that the government is going to be backing anyone up, including the people who are backed up and their creditors. That's one of the reasons why we have had so many problems when the government is involved in the housing business or anything else, because it changes everybody's attitudes and reduces the discipline that the market normally imposes on people.
Lou is in downtown Los Angeles. Lou, you're on with Peter Wallison and LA Times' Michael Hiltig. Go ahead, Lou.
I served on the Federal Home Loan Bank Board back in the 90s, the board in San Francisco, and one point I wanted to make is that there's always been an understanding in the financial community that that Freddie and Fannie weren't capitalized sufficiently to take care of problems when there was a downturn, and that hasn't been really discussed here. It's been more about the downturn itself, but fundamentally these two institutions were not properly capitalized to begin with. I've got a question for each one of the panelists. So my understanding is that...
Lou, tell you what, Lou, hold the question. We're going to take a break, and Lou, you just hold right on, okay? I want them to have plenty of time to answer your question. Lou, downtown L.A. has a question for Peter Wallison, former House counsel under Ronald Reagan, and Michael Hiltig, L.A. Times Pulitzer Prize winner, is his opponent. Michael Hiltig argues that the housing meltdown was more about lax oversight, failure to implement the appropriate regulations and rules. Peter Wallison says it had very little to do with it and everything to do with bad government policy that encouraged lenders and put pressure on lenders to making loans to people who otherwise would not have been able to qualify for them. All that coming up. 1-800-222-KBC is the number, but first with the news, here he is. And we are continuing our debate between Peter Wallison. Peter Wallison is a former House counsel for Ronald Reagan and a member of the Financial Inquiry Commission, filed a dissent and argued that the reason for the housing and financial meltdown had very little to do with Wall Street greed or lack of regulation, which is what the left, the Democrats, maintain. His opponent is Michael Hiltig. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the LA Times. His argument is that lax oversight and Wall Street shenanigans are, in fact, the principal causes for the housing meltdown. He wrote a book called The New Deal, A Modern History, and we have that up on our website. I want to say before we go back to the gentleman that Peter came on this show yesterday and said that he would debate anybody, anywhere, at any time about this issue. And I had just read an article that Michael Hiltig had written about the Volcker Rule, where he argued that the Volcker Rule was objected to by bankers, and he suggested that the failure for the rules to be there was one of the reasons for the housing meltdown. And I assume, based on other things I'd read by Michael Hiltig, that he took that position that it was about Wall Street greed and lax oversight. I want to say also that when we emailed Michael, he promptly said yes, didn't say what the ground rules were, knew full well that this was going to be an away game for him, yet he came on promptly. And, Michael, I want to commend you for doing that. I really do appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to do it.
Okay, let's go back to Lou. Now, Lou had said that he served on a board, the Fed board in San Francisco, I think you said, Lou?
Federal Home Loan Bank Board.
Right.
It's another government-sponsored enterprise, but we were more heavily capitalized than Fannie and Freddie, and we haven't had the same problems.
Right, and before the break, you said you had a question you wanted to put to Peter and to Michael.
Yeah, to both of them, really. I believe it was Fannie that wanted to buy countrywide loans. And Countrywide said, we're not going to sell them to you unless you take what now we would look back upon and say was junk. And the decision by Fannie was to lower their standards so that they could, in fact, take the junk so that they could keep the relationship with Countrywide and maintain their market share. And it's also my understanding that Fannie had trouble keeping a chief risk officer in place because of the lowering of those standards. So what have I read that's wrong that would explain this away, or Am I correct in understanding that, in fact, there was explicitly a decision made to lower standards at Fannie?
Peter, why don't you respond first, and then Michael, then you can respond, please.
Countrywide was Fannie's biggest supplier of loans, and that's because Countrywide was producing the subprime loans that Fannie and Freddie needed to meet the affordable housing requirements. In fact, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the affordable housing requirements made Countrywide the largest supplier of subprime loans in the country. So I think whatever you had heard was kind of backwards. Fannie was the one that made Countrywide into an important supplier. Countrywide became very rich, so did Angelo Mozillo, because they were able to supply more of these loans than anyone else.
Michael?
Well, I'm not actually familiar with this what the caller said about the relationship, but to say that Fannie and Freddie, or Fannie or Freddie, made Countrywide and made Angelo Mozillo what they were, I think that is exactly backwards. I mean, all the evidence that we've seen, all of the testimony from insiders suggests it was exactly the other way, that Mozillo and Countrywide, they were drivers of this market. They plunged into it. They drove it. They were the biggest players. They were the ones who were more responsible maybe than anyone else, maybe with a couple of exceptions, to destroying underwriting standards in this market, and they enjoyed the ride while they could. The caller pointed out that one of the problems that everybody knew about in the market at the time was that Fannie and Freddie were not well capitalized, were not adequately capitalized for the risk. Nobody was adequately capitalized for the risks, in part because our banking regulators did not insist that the banks that were playing in this market be adequately capitalized. So, and that's why we ended up with Bear Stearns going out of business, Lehman Brothers going out of business. We ended up with Countrywide in the arms of Bank of America, which at this moment we don't know if it's adequately capitalized. That was a major problem, is that the regulators who were responsible for the safety and soundness of the U.S. banking industry were not doing their jobs. They had the power to hold everybody up to and including Goldman Sachs to higher standards, and they did not do so.
Let's go to Tim.
I'd like to say something,
quick one,
Larry, and right at this point, because I think this is quite important. There's kind of this idea that Countrywide could produce any kind of junky mortgage it wanted and sell it. That isn't how the market works. It has never been that way. It is the buyer that determines the quality. It's the buyer that is taking the risk, not the one that originates the mortgage, but the one who actually buys it and holds it or guarantees it. And so Countrywide would never have become anything significant if they didn't have a buyer for the junk that they were creating. And who was that buyer? It was Fannie Mae, and to some extent it was Freddie Mac. That's the whole point. The point is that those two institutions that dominated the market created the demand for these mortgages. And if they hadn't created that demand, the mortgages never would have been originated or created.
Michael?
Well, once again, that's a lot different from saying that federal housing policy is responsible for the bubble. Everybody knew that Fannie and Freddie were a problem, as I said before. Nobody knew what the commitment was of the federal government behind them, but they were happy to let everybody think that they were protected by a government guarantee. And as a result, their managers, yes, there's no two ways about it, they were irresponsible, but that's not the same as saying that they were setting policy or that they reflected federal housing policy or that they were the result of federal housing policy that was the problem. These are very, very different things.
Well, no, I think actually, if I can continue, Larry, I think they're exactly a demonstration of the fact that it was federal housing policy, because Fannie and Freddie did not really make these decisions either. The decisions were made for them by the Department of Housing and Urban Development that set the affordable housing requirements. So Fannie and Freddie were simply required to comply with the quotas that were being imposed on them by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That was federal housing policy, and they simply carried it out.
Well, that is not the way these things work. The fact is that Fannie and Freddie were independent companies. They were traded publicly. They were not agents of federal housing policy. They may have benefited from federal housing policy. Fannie and Freddie executives were not setting federal housing policy, and nothing about federal housing policy required Fannie and Freddie to connive in the reduction of standards that we saw in the bubble.
Let me go back again to make sure you understand this, Michael, because it's very important. The affordable housing requirements were federal policy. They were imposed on Fannie and Freddie. They were required to meet these quotas. This was government regulation that was requiring them to do this. This was not voluntary on the part.
No, but that's not so. These were not federal agencies. They were independent companies. They were publicly traded. They had responsibilities to their shareholders. If they chose to take advantage of federal housing policy, that's one thing. But once again, there was nothing in federal housing policy that required anybody to destroy underwriting standards to the extent that happened. And the fact that Angela Mazzillo and Countrywide took advantage of this and went hog wild, that does not tell you that it's federal housing policy or affordable housing policy that was responsible, because the bottom line is that if you look at the portfolio that Fannie and Freddie ended up holding, it performed much, much better than the portfolio that Countrywide and all of its cousins on Wall Street sold to non-Fannie and Freddie
Peter, take
buyers.
take 30 seconds to respond, then we'll take a break.
Yeah, well, we understand that the portfolio is somewhat better at Fannie and Freddie, but they became insolvent because they were following what they were required to do by the government. And unless you understand that, unless the listeners understand that, then there's no point in discussing this. If the government says to you, you are required to do X or Y, Congress has passed a law that says you are required to do X or Y. If you don't do it, they could be fined or they could get into further difficulties. There was HUD could have fined them $100,000 for every failure they had to meet the affordable housing requirements in each year that those requirements were placed on them.
Okay, we're going to take a break right now. That was Peter Wallison. He's the former House counsel under Ronald Reagan, former member of the Financial Inquiry Commission, filed a 100-page dissent arguing that the meltdown, the financial crisis, had everything to do with government policy, very little to do with Wall Street greed and lack of oversight. Michael Hiltzik believes the latter, that it had to do with Wall Street behavior and greed and shenanigans and lack of oversight. And that government policy had very little to do with it. Michael and Peter, don't go away. 1-800-222-KBC. We're going to go back to the phones. We come back. Tim in Pasadena wants to ask Michael, did government make this all about race? Tim, don't go away. This is Larry Elder. So our final segment in our debate between Peter Wallison, a member of the Financial Inquiry Commission, who argues that the housing meltdown had everything to do with bad government policy, and Michael Hiltzik, who argues that it had to do with Wall Street greed, Wall Street shenanigans, and the failure of appropriate oversight. Tim is in Pasadena. Tim, you're on with Mr. Wallison, Mr. Hiltzik, and Larry.
Hello, gentlemen. I'd like to change just a little bit of what Larry said. I don't think it's all about race, but I think the issue of race is kind of what's been on Larry's mind. He can correct me if I'm wrong on that. The government getting involved in how they look as it is in public appearance about race. See, I think what happened here, now this is just my opinion, but I think there's some good evidence for it. What's happened here, you can't say these people will behave such and such a way because people will call you a racist. I think that was taken into consideration when they were thinking about making these loans. And so a lot of people were looking at their image. And that's what I want to ask you, Michael, about. Are you willing to admit that people were doing that?
Well, let me try to unpack a little bit about what you said. I think if you really want to talk about race, it sounds to me that you're making an allusion to the fact that the Community Reinvestment Act, which was designed to move mortgage lending more into underprivileged communities in the United States, that was about race. Now, sure, black people, Hispanic homeowners are overrepresented in these underprivileged communities. But if you look at the record of the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, what you find is that subprime mortgages that underperform or that go delinquent or into default are underrepresented in these communities, that in fact they performed a lot better, that the borrowers who were affected by the CRA did much better and behaved much more responsibly. And I go back to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission report once again, this is the commission that Peter served on, quoted Lou Ranieri, who was a banker at Salomon Brothers, who really created the mortgage securitization market. They quoted him as saying, CRA was a pain in the neck for us, but it made a big difference in the communities where it served. You were putting money into the communities in ways that really stabilized those communities and made a difference, and he means a positive difference. And what he said further was that lenders, including Countrywide, now this is the company that we've been talking about, Angela Mazzillo was its chairman, its founder, its chief executive, they used pro-homeownership policies like the CRA as a smokescreen, and that's Lou Ranieri's word, to do away with underwriting standards such as requiring sizable down payments. And the danger, Ranieri said, was that it gave air cover to all of this kind of madness that had nothing to do with the housing goal. So the housing goal was responsible. The housing goals actually worked. They stabilized communities. They got mortgage money into communities. They promoted home ownership. That worked. But you had unscrupulous lenders like Countrywide, people like Angela Mazzillo, who took advantage of it and helped create the problem.
Peter, I want you to respond too, but one of the reasons that Tim asked the question is because I have also made the argument that one of the drivers behind the Community Reinvestment Act and other government policy was to increase home ownership on the part of minorities, specifically blacks and Hispanics.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. It was an important part of that policy. The Community Reinvestment Act required banks to make loans that they would not otherwise have made. And now there are two possibilities here. One is that they wouldn't have made the loans because they were discriminating against minorities, or they wouldn't have made the loans because they were not profitable loans. The idea that they were discriminating, I think, has been pretty much shown not to be true. So the other possibility that they were required to make loans that they didn't want to make because the loans were not going to be profitable to them seems to be more likely. And if you look at some of the data that we had, even the FDIC had from banks and others, that showed that if you looked at all their delinquent loans, large portions, much larger portions of those delinquent loans came from those kinds of areas, it goes without saying. Now, that might be a good policy, but the problem is that if the government wants to do that, the government ought to have an explicit program that uses taxpayer funds to work on produce a social policy of some kind. But what the government was doing here to the banks with CRA and to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was forcing private companies, private shareholder-owned companies, to do some sort of government policy for them without having to put anything into the budget. That's one of the problems with this whole operation. It used government power to force the private sector to do something that the government should have been doing in the normal way with taxpayer funds.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. Peter Wollaston, thank you very much for joining me. Michael Ilzig, LA Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, author of the book The New Deal, A Modern History. Michael, Peter, again, thank you very much. And again, Peter or Michael, I want to thank you for coming on. You knew it would be 2 against 1. I think it's a reflection, I hope anyway, of the confidence of your position and the respect that you thought I would give you by coming on. I hope you appreciated the way I handled everything.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, and nice to meet you, Michael.
Let's do this tomorrow. We're going to be talking to the front page editor of The Blaze. He is going to talk to us about why a Chicano studies course in Arizona was ruled illegal under a law that says you can't have a course that promotes racial division. And the LA Times wrote a column about it, an article about it, and didn't tell